You remember the first time that you bought your parents' dinner? You remember that? Like some of the kids in here are like, no, and I'm like, oh, take note because your opportunity's coming. You're going to go to lunch somewhere today, right? But you remember the first time you bought dinner for mom and dad, right? I don't know if it was the exact first time, but I remember the first costly time that I picked up the tab. We were on vacation with my parents in our early 20s. We went to this fancy restaurant and up in the mountains in the Ozarks. It was my mom and dad, Stephanie and I. We probably had a kid at that point. I don't remember if it was pre-children, but probably not. So we probably had a kid with us, a baby. My grandmother was with us, and the bill came, and I just reached over and grabbed it and paid it. And it felt good, right? It was interesting because, there was no strings attached to that dinner, and it wasn't a $25 dinner by any means. It set me back a little bit, but we had the resources, and it was good. It was just fun to do, and it was an opportunity, and it wasn't because Dad had paid for 3, and I'm kind of doing the math and me okay, this would kind of make us even. It wasn't like if I do this, then you'll do this kind of thing. It was just, we had the opportunity to do it and did it. And, my dad growing up didn't say okay, Cameron, here's the rules for picking up the tab. You should probably try to do this. Here's the best. So there was no object lesson, but my dad's actually probably one of the most generous people I know. And I'd seen Dad buy dinner hundreds of times, right? And I've seen him pick up dinner and get abused by that, and by people say, hey, he's saying, hey, let's go to dinner, my treat. And they order extra appetizers and desserts and all the things, and Dad would just gladly smile and pay. And that's just kind of the way he was, whether they had means or didn't have means. That was his generous heart, and it had kind of just spoiled over and kind of spilled over, and I'd seen it modeled, and it was just something that was my opportunity to do, right? To be generous. When we talk about generosity in the church, often it's not met with open arms, right? And frankly, it's warranted sometimes when we talk about generosity. There's plenty of public abuses in the church of, so as we kind of approach our text in Acts chapter 11 today, don't hear if the application of our sermon is, the pastor thinks we need to buy a plane for him to fly around, and that's wrong, right? Because it's for sure not the case. I would probably advocate more for maybe a new truck and a boat. Probably a boat before a truck, actually. So if I ever begin to say, hey, I think Impact needs a boat, then you can begin to condemn us for talking about generosity, right? But generosity, here's the thing about generosity is generosity comes and it flows out of our heart, right? And it's evidenced of a transformed heart. Generosity doesn't just flow from our wallets, right? And so that's kind of where I want us to wrap our heads around as we kind of jump back into the study of Acts today, is that transformative generosity flows from the heart, not from the wallet. And what we see, and we talked about last week as we saw this new church, this church plant, if you will, in Antioch. Saul and Barnabas are there and they're teaching. You remember if we scrolled up just one verse from where we'll start today in Acts 11, 26, it actually says that Saul and Barnabas were there for about a year and they're teaching, right? And so you have this young church, people come into faith, many people, a great many people, it says multiple times, right? A bunch of people are coming to faith. They're sitting under this teaching, and what happens in this young church is an outburst of generosity, right? This launching pad for global Christianity coming from Antioch, and we begin to see this generous heart form and be evidenced. So let's talk through a text here. Let's walk through it. Acts chapter 11, we're going to start in verse number 27 today. And again, kind of wrap your brains, look through those lenses. A transformative generosity flows from the heart, not from our wallet. response. Verse number 27. Now in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. And one of them named Agabus stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, and they did so, sending it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. We've been in this series kind of tracking this global movement to the ends of the earth, empowered witnesses to Jesus. And we're just walking through the book of Acts. If you don't have one of your journaling Bibles, I just invite you to slip out and grab one. We've got one. We want to give it to you. But as we kind of look and explore these texts every single week, what I want us to do is, one of the reasons we give you a journaling Bible, some people like to write in their Bibles, some don't. So we just give you one that you can write and highlight and circle and ask questions about. But we want to kind of pay attention to key places, key names, especially as we go through this part 3. We're going to start seeing people moving around all over the place. And so as we just kind of think through some things, right now in these days, verse 27 it says, right? So again, this is during the year in which Saul and Barnabas were teaching the church in Antioch. In these days, prophets. So circle that word or underline that word, prophets. Sometimes we confuse and we're not sure exactly what prophets means. This is actually a really big deal because this is the first time in the New Testament that we see prophet refer to a Christian prophet. And we will continue to see prophecy play a big role in the rest of the book of Acts. So prophets, just to clarify, a prophet actually speaks under direct revelation from God to people. So this is a message given to a person from God, and the prophet's job is just to speak that message, okay? So you're with me there? We've seen some interesting things happen in the book of Acts. We've seen people speaking in tongues, is what the Bible calls it, and uses this language. And so we're talking prophecy and tongues are very different things. Prophecy, again, is direct, it's intelligible, it's, hey, God said this, tell this to the people, and so they do. And a tongue, when somebody was speaking in tongues, it needed translation, right? Nobody understood what was happening, or people would hear it in their own language, but the communicator wouldn't understand what was being said. So very different things. So in those days, prophets, they came from Jerusalem. Jerusalem being kind of the epicenter of Christianity as a whole. Jerusalem, in this case, when we're talking contextually, we're talking about kind of thinking through the church, the Christian church in Jerusalem, the parent church, right? So Antioch being the church plant, Jerusalem being the parent church, there's a prophet that comes, and the prophet's name is Agabus. And Agabus stands up and he foretells by the Spirit, which kind of gives us a clue that this is a word from God. This is a prophetic utterance coming from God. So by the Spirit, that there would be a great famine over all the world. And there's this interesting parenthetical reference that just says, this took place in the days of Claudius. Now, again, I want us to be students of the word. And so as we look, we're asking questions. What does this mean? Why is it in parentheses? Luke writes this book of Acts, and he's writing it in hindsight. So he's writing it a couple decades after this based on research and interviews and all of his stuff, and he systematically kind of lays out this is the history of the early church. And so what's happening is Luke says Agabus came and he gave us this prophetic utterance. He tells us that there's going to be a famine, and then Luke's like, and you remember it happened under the rule of Claudius. So when we go to extra biblical historical information and data from the first century, Claudius actually ruled from 45 to 54 AD, 41 to 54. And in 45 AD, there was a massive flood of the Nile River, and the Nile overflowed its banks, and it put this massive flood, and it flooded the area known as the breadbasket of the world, and it ruined all of the crops. In fact, it not just ruined them, but in the runoff and all of the things, it actually took about 3 years to recover. So everybody hearing this letter, reading this letter as Luke portrays and communicates the history would have remembered, oh yeah, that happened, right? So Luke's just saying, hey, this is what happens with prophecies, is when they're actually come from God, they actually are fulfilled, right? So that's why this reference is there. So Agabus comes, says, hey, there's going to be a famine in the land. Luke reminds us this actually happened. You remember that under Claudius. Verse number 29, this is where we'll land and spend some time. So the disciples determined, every one of them, according to his ability, to send relief, to send resources, to be generous to the brothers living in Judea. So the disciples, they determined, right? They hear this prophecy that there's going to be this famine that's going to happen, and so they instantly, their reaction was generosity, because generosity flows from our hearts, not from our wallets. And it has this phrase, everyone according to his own ability. This is really important when it comes to generosity, because this is where the abuse happens, both in the church and outside of the church. Is we say you should do this because, right? But what we see in the scripture is everyone according to his own ability, right? There was no guilt trip. There was no pressure. It was, hey, here's what's going to happen. How do we want to respond? And we're like, man, we got to respond. We got to help these guys out. This is actually an Old Testament practice that would have happened, and it's referred to as a free will offering in the Old Testament a number of different times. And I'll read just one passage for you in Exodus chapter 35, when Moses was helping build the temple, verse number 29. It says, all the men and women, the people of Israel, right, whose heart moved them to bring anything for the work that the Lord had commanded by Moses to be done, brought it as a free will offering to the Lord. So there's this principle that we see when their hearts were moved, they each determined to bring their offering, their free will offering, as an offering to the Lord. This is what's happening, is this early church is recognizing this heart of generosity coming from God. And as their hearts were moved, as they understood, what are these people going to do? How are they going to live? How are they going to sustain themselves? What are they going to eat? And they're like, we got to help. Like, we got to do something. We can't maybe fix everything, but we can be part of it. And so they collect their money, and they actually send it, right? They gathered it. They entrusted it to the elders, and it's sent off, right? No strings attached. No, do this and then this. It was just, hey, we're just going to send it. We're going to trust that you're going to use it the way God needs you and wants you to use it. And so it's really fascinating to me in this story, because we see Antioch, this new church plant, right? Jerusalem, the parent church, and Antioch kind of like picking up the tab. It says, hey, we're in on this, right? It's not just up to you. It's not somebody else, but hey, this is a personal responsibility to act with generosity, right? This is a personal responsibility to say, hey, God has worked and moved and been generous with me, and I'm going to be generous with others. So this church responded to what they had seen, what they had benefited from, what they had observed, and they were ready to mirror, to put into practice. Because transformative generosity flows from the heart, not from the wallet. So when I look at a couple of these verses and I think through what does it mean to be generous, there's a couple things that I just observed, and maybe lessons, if you will, that I want us to learn about generosity. Number one, generosity is always selfless. Did you notice what the church in Antioch got, what they received for sending this money? Nope. It's not, right? It's not there. It didn't matter to them. They were just being selfless. They were just responding to a need. They sent the money, and they just trusted God to use it, right? Generosity communicates to God, I trust you. Right? When we are generous, we're communicating to God that I trust you, right? Whatever time or talents or treasures that I'm being generous with, I'm trusting God to use it how he wants to. Think about this, the famine that this recovery, this humanitarian recovery act that they were contributing to hadn't even happened yet. It was just gonna happen. We were just told by a prophet that this was going to happen, but their trust was so high in God that they responded generously. Sometimes, and I say this with kind heart as best I can, sometimes we're only generous when we get something in return. Right? Sometimes we only donate to a charity because we're actually participating in a raffle, or we're getting a round of golf, or I'm buying a guided fishing trip, right? Which I'm willing to go on with you if you do, right? But sometimes that's our only framework for generosity is I'm going to go and I'm going to give, but only if I get something in return, some sort of recognition, a pen, a plaque, a letter. Right? But that's not what we see from this church. That generosity is completely selfless. Selfless means no strings attached, right? Use it how you see best. We do our best at Impact to model this. We have, as I've mentioned a few times, and we'll continue to mention because it's part of how we operate financially, is we take a portion, 10% actually, of every dollar that comes into Impact, and we give it away. We want to model this as best we can, so we make it a priority to give back a portion of what we receive so that we can support people and entities and organizations and causes that are important to us. So we have partners, strategic partners in our area like True Light Ministries, who came just a couple weeks ago and shared a little bit about what they do. They're a live-in foster care system. They have between 40 and 45 kids that live on their facilities 24/7 in the foster care system, right? They need resources, and as we have opportunities, we give them resources. And I don't give them resources and say, hey, then I need you to come and do this for me. And I don't give them resources so that they would recognize us or so that we would get a mention on their website. Or I don't say, this is exactly how I want you to use it. We just give it to them and trust it, right? They're a trusted partner of ours. We have missionaries that serve on the field. I had just a few weeks ago, we had Nathaniel Evans, who's going to Albania, who's actually literally in Albania at the moment, right? And we were able to just help finish out the support that he needed to raise for his year on mission in Albania. We have Jonathan Ledwing that has been in Guadalajara, Mexico with navigators for almost 3 years now. Right, serving faithfully. We give to Jonathan every single month, and we get updates, and he lets us know what's going on. And by the way, if you haven't seen or read or received his updates, God is doing some amazing things on the college campus in which he is serving, and he has led a number of his very close friends over time to faith in Christ. Right, and so we're happy to do that. Right, we just give that money like we're just a conduit. Right? Now, we could hoard it, and we see things like a building plan, and we're like, hey, why are we giving away $30,000 a year? Like, why are we giving away all this money? Why don't we just save it and store it and use it for us, right? Because then it becomes about us, and there's a principle of a freewill offering, right? Responding generously to say, it's not about us, it's about the kingdom. And generosity is selfless. Secondly, I would say that generosity is, it's generous, right? It's over and above, like it's an abundant, right? The only metric that we see these people responding to is whatever they had. Right? They didn't say, hey, we have this percentage, I can give this, or, they just said, man, this is what I got, can you use it? And they just gave it. They were being generous with everything that they had, and that's what we see as the model of generosity, is just simply that it's generous. They didn't have a spreadsheet that said, hey, here's the length of how the banks are going to overflow, and this is how many villages, and this is how many people, and this is how long it's going to take to recover, and they're going to need X number of meals per person, per family, per region. So it's going to now some of you that are like, you love spreadsheets, you're getting fired up. You're like, this is going to be awesome. I'll make a plan for all this, right? They didn't have any of that. They just said, man, this is going to be a big deal. The prophet said there's going to be a massive famine in the area, right? So we're just going to give as much as we can give. Like, as much as I have, we're going to give. There's some things about generosity when we think about generosity, just simply being generous over and above. When we live a generous life, we create a margin for God to fill. When we live a generous life, it reminds us that we are not the source. When we live a generous life, it connects our money to kingdom purpose. It gives our jobs eternal significance. It breaks greed off of our hearts. Generosity is generous. Number 3, generosity is corporate. And we talk a lot about relationships that impact, and it's a big deal. I actually believe, and I've said many, many times, that I believe relationships are the absolute magic sauce to spiritual formation. Right? You want to grow, you grow together with people, vulnerable, below the surface. This is not pretense, not pretending to be something we're not, but together. Like, the Christian life isn't meant to be a solo life. And just as an aside, if you're wondering and you're like, man, I'm just kind of a lone ranger, right? Can I just say, like, there's so much more to walking with God. There's so much more growth that happens in community with one another, right? In the same way that learning and accountability and formation happens in the context of relationship, generosity is best done corporately and in unity. Right? We celebrate what God does collectively. We partner with kingdom-centered organizations and people all over the world each month, because together our money can do so much more than if we were doing it on our own. Right? Think about, literally, we partner with mission organization that has about 4,000 missionaries worldwide. We couldn't support that as a church. There's no way. Right? But we can give to them and say, hey, we want whatever our portion is, we want it to be used for kingdom purposes in a much bigger and broader way than we could ever imagine. Kind of in an Ephesians 2, like more than we can ever even think or imagine kind of way. God, just use it collectively, corporately, together. We send money. Now, if I may, let me just tell you a little bit about some things going on at Impact here. A couple months ago, we launched something called the Engage Initiative. Some of you have seen it. Some of you were here. Some of you maybe have just seen the table over there and the picture of the building and the thing that says Engage Initiative and these 2 tubes, and you're like, I don't understand what's going on. Let me give you a high level. Invite you to our YouTube channel or our website for more information. There's all that's over there, right? I just want to give you a highlight. This is something that we began to do about a year ago, is to plan our property, like the property that God has given us, that we believe that God has ordained for us to build on one day. We began to figure out, what is this going to look like? How much is it going to cost? And let me just say, I've said it before multiple times, it is way more expensive than we thought it was going to be. Construction is stupidly expensive. Likely isn't going to change anytime soon, right? So our response to that isn't necessarily to squeeze the turnip, right? To say, hey, you should give more, right? The Engage Initiative actually had wheels in motion before we ever even got a number. Because what we're wanting to do with the Engage Initiative is to tune our hearts and our minds to engage in 3 phases: engage the next generation, engage our neighbors, and to engage the nations. And so as we kind of launched into part 1 of the Engage Initiative, we challenge you to join us in 2 specific areas: people and pledges, right? Is there a financial component to it? For sure, but it's only $40.90. That's all we're saying is, hey, would you consider partnering with us $40.90 a month? And you're like, it's going to be a while before we get $9 million. It's going to be a good minute. at $40.90, right? It's gonna take a little bit. We're gonna really get used to this gym. It's gonna be awesome. Right? Why $40.90? Because it's a reminder. It draws our attention to Isaiah 40, verse number 9, which tells us that our primary responsibility is to be a bearer of good news. Right? We want more than anything else in this community to be known as bearers of good news. Right? So we engage people with the good news. You can give $40.90, and that's great. But the most exciting part of it is the people, not the pledges. Is to actually engage, and in fact, in a couple weeks, the week of September 22nd, 3 weeks from now, we're actually going to have, with all of our small groups, an Engage Week, where we're inviting our small groups to go out, and we've targeted some key areas, some strategic areas close to us here, mostly south of I-10, where we've seen lots and lots and lots of new houses and new growth in our area. And we're going to hit the streets, and we're going to literally do our best to knock on as many doors as possible, inviting them to come to Impact Church. Because it's not just about the pledges, it's about the people. In fact, it's way more about the people than it is the pledges. Now, you may be asking yourself, because I haven't given an update recently, I will share with you a few updates on numbers, and because it's exciting. On a pledge level, since May, we've actually received and contributed a little over $17,600 to our building fund since May, which is awesome. Yeah, that's exciting. You can clap for that. That's a combination of budgetary giving, pledges that are coming in, a generous matching grant that's been given for the Engage initiative. But that brings our total building fund to a little over $152,000, which is exciting. But listen, $152,000, if we doubled that, made it $304, it doesn't get us very much closer to $9 million at all, right? So that's why I'm like, it's not about that. We've had specifically, and these are represented in the little tubes with little ping pong balls, like we've had 29 people, however, since May, specifically invited, who have attended Impact Church as a result of the Engage initiative, right? Which is super, super exciting. Right? And so we're going to hit the streets in a couple weeks, and I'm going to invite you to participate. If you aren't plugged into a small group, just let us know which night. There's going to be some going on Sunday and some Tuesday, some Wednesday, some Thursday. There's going to be all different nights. You can jump in on one of those and go with us. Right? We want to get outside. Right? We want to focus on other people to be a part of what God is doing here. So where's the line in the sand when it comes to dollars, right? I don't have any idea, like 9 million probably, right? If you have a rich uncle and you want to, that's cool, like call him, like please, that would be awesome, right? But it's not about that, right? It's not just about that. What I hear more than anything is not dollars and cents, but I hear stories of people who have moved to the area, been able to connect, who've joined our faith family, community being formed, lives being changed because of Impact Church. Right? We don't want a building just so that we don't have to set up and tear down every Sunday. We want a building as a cornerstone, as a lighthouse, if you will, in this community, so that people know, hey, this is a symbol of hope. This is a symbol of restoration. This is a symbol of redemption, right? And they can come and be a part and plug in to Impact Church and experience God in a new way, in a relational way, and forever be changed. So if you're kind of wondering how in the world does this all pertain to me, like we're talking about generosity, now you're talking about, like here's the thing. How do we cultivate a generous heart? Maybe it's to participate in the Engage initiative, maybe, right? Stop by the booth, grab a table, a card or whatever, look into it. Happy to answer any questions. But more than anything else, I think we're called, somebody years ago put it in these 3 phrases. I said it earlier, just kind of in passing, because it's like embedded in my brain. We're called to be generous with our time, generous with our talents, and generous with our treasures, right? It's probably a Baptist dude because it all starts with, it's alliterated, right? Yeah. Listen, be generous with your time. What does that look like? Be generous with your time, maybe coming early and serving on a Sunday morning. But it could very well be going across the street and talking with your neighbor. Right? Actually saying, hey, why don't you guys come over and let's just like hang out and get to know one another. Right? Investing time, probably our most valuable commodity, just spending time with people. Like invest your time, be generous with your time, with your talents, the things that you're good at. Like if we believe that God has created you, he knit you together in your mother's womb, that he has fearfully and wonderfully made you, and I believe all of that is true, then God has embedded in you talents and experiences and passions that he wants to use for his glory. And if you're not using your talents, if you're not being generous with your talents, then you're not doing all of the things that God wants you to do. So be generous with your time, with your talents, and with your treasure. Like, don't hold on to these things. Like, live open-handedly. It's been said that transformation is always at the growth edge of life. Right? When our beliefs, when our practices, when our comfort zones, when they're challenged, when we do a deep dive and live open-handedly, we let God in. We let people in. That's when we begin to see the transformation. That's when we step up and we grab the bill and say, hey, I'll take care of that. Right? In Antioch, the church, this generosity was a symbol, was a tangible, visible evidence of a transformed young church. Right? Maybe that's an area of growth for you. Maybe that's an area that God is wanting you to transform, is in your financial generosity, to say, hey, don't be so critical, like just be generous financially, and that's okay. And maybe you're already like, I kind of feel like I'm there, and like I'm not being prideful, but like I think I have a healthy relationship with this, and I'm good. That's totally fine. Like I'm not trying to say buy the pastor a boat, right? That's not the goal. I would take it. No, man, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Right. Here's the thing. Maybe there's another area, the time aspect, where we're not generous, where we hold on to, where our talents, and we're like, man, I'm really good at this, but I do this every day, and I really don't want to do this again on Sunday. Right? Could it be possibly that maybe God brought you here at Impact to do the things that you're really good at doing? Whatever you're holding on to, right? Whatever it may be, transformation's at the growth edge of life. I believe that transformation only happens when preceded by surrender. Right? Just like Jesus prayed, not my will, but yours, O Lord. We're called to surrender, to die to ourselves, to follow Jesus with all that we are. So whatever we're holding on to, whatever hurts and pains we have, could we surrender? Could we hand those over? Could we release control and let God heal and restore and transform? And I would just say as we close, like the only way that we can be generous is because God was generous with us. The Bible actually says that God gave, because of his love for us, God gave his only son, right? Who was born of a virgin, who died on the cross to pay a debt that he wasn't due to him, it was due to us. And this act of generosity, if we will receive and accept and surrender to that act of generosity, I can promise you your life will change forever. Let's pray together, church.